In this video, we will be covering practices associated with vector layer symbolization, or the customization of the appearance of vector layers in ArcMap, in order to reflect best practices of cartographic design. In our map right now, we have three different data layers. We have a point vector layer corresponding to national capitals. We have a rivers line layer corresponding to the locations of rivers around the world. And then we have a polygon layer corresponding to the borders of different countries. We have these three different vector layers all in one map document. Before proceeding, I would like to demonstrate the simple process of saving a map document. We simply would go to File and Save As. And note here that we do not have to work through our folder connection system. I will go into my workspace nonetheless where I do have my data saved, and I will simply call this reference mapping. Note that when you save a document in ArcMap, your map document does not actually contain any data. The map document simply refers to the structure of the document, the extent of your map, and then any style properties that are associated with any of the layers. The data themselves are still stored in their original files and locations, and your map document simply contains references to those data. So it is very, very important going forward to ensure that you do not move any of your data layers. Else you will come up against some serious issues with the data integrity, and some of your layers may appear to be missing later on. In this video, as I mentioned, we will be customizing the appearance of these layers in order to match cartographic design conventions. In this case, we will be making two different kinds of maps. In one case, we will be making a country-level reference map of the country of Spain, and then we'll also be making a regional reference map, wherein we will be symbolizing countries using different colors in order to help the user differentiate between neighboring features. Let's begin though by making a country-level reference map using several different data layers. We'll start with these data layers that we have included already. Let's start customizing. If we want to make this map look as good as possible, we want to make some design decisions that reflect what people are used to seeing when they see maps that are created in print. In most cases, we use an appropriate color like a green, often a light green or a beigeish color to represent land masses, and we will often use blue to represent water features of different kinds. In this case, we have areas representing an ocean that are simply not contained within any layer. That is because we can assume where oceans are and infer where oceans are simply on the basis of the absence of any landmass data. And then we also have rivers, so we could represent those using a blue hue. And then we can also customize the appearance of our national capitals layer just to represent something that is more traditionally associated with the symbol for a city. So let's get going just by customizing the background color first, because we can actually specify a background color for our map to represent the presence of an ocean. To customize this appearance, we would simply right-click anywhere within our data frame and choose Data Frame Properties. Then we would simply go up to the Frame tab, and for a background, we could specify a background color. And one good option here might be light blue. We can customize that color further if we like, but let's just get started by selecting that. We can then hit Apply and hit OK. And we'll see that this certainly improves the appearance of our layer for the time being. The ocean is now more clearly defined by color, and we can proceed by customizing our countries layer and our river layer. In order to customize the appearance of a data layer, we would open up the layer properties for that layer, and then find the Symbology tab. This is perhaps a little counterintuitive because many people would think that the Display tab would contain the style properties, but it is indeed only several properties like transparency that are visible under Display, whereas Symbology consists of most of the properties that you would want to look for. At this point, we will be working with what is called single symbol symbology. That means that every feature within the dataset will have the same symbolization properties associated with it. And in order to move forward, we can simply click on single symbol, make sure that's selected here, and then we can just click on this color swatch. And if we look down here in the list of default options, we can see that there are indeed some decent default options that we might consider. But instead, I think we might find some other options here by customizing things a little bit that work a little bit better. If we started here with this olive color, which is still kind of bright and pastel, we can see that that matches slightly better the conventional appearance that we might see for map colors of landmasses, but it's still not perfect for what we're looking for. And this is really just an iterative process. We can explore different symbology settings in order to come up with the styling that we're looking for. I'm just going to hit more colors, and you can see here that this then gives us the ability to specify what are called RGB values for these colors. That simply stands for red, green, and blue, and we can customize on a scale of 0 to 255 the presence of any given primary color, at least from an RGB sense. And note that you can really customize both the lightness as well as the hue and saturation just by modifying the intensity of these different sliders. You can also choose CMYK, which is a more print-friendly version of this, and also HSV. So if you want to customize the hue, so if you actually want to customize the color itself, I recommend using RGB, but then for HSV, you can customize the hue, certainly from this tab, but then the saturation is essentially the intensity of the color, and the V corresponds to value, which is the lightness of the color. So we could play around with the hue here. Note as I drag it, we can choose different hue values. If we wanted kind of a yellowish green here, not too saturated, maybe moderate saturation and moderate lightness, we could find that right here. And then we could hit OK. Now that to me looks quite good for a general landmass color. Perhaps we could even make it a little bit lighter. So we'll go back in through that same process. Note that cartographic design is very much an iterative process, so we'll make decisions and then we'll decide that something else would look slightly better, so we can go ahead and tweak things continuously. As you make decisions for one layer, you'll often be tempted to go back and make tweaks to other layers in order to make everything look the way you want it to look. And that is simply part of the process. We can also customize not just the fill color, but the outline color for the countries as well. So if we wanted to take the fill color that we have here and bring it over to our outline, we could just take these same values here that we have for HSV, and we could move them over to the line stroke color and just modify that and make it a little darker perhaps. So our values here are 69 for the hue, 15%, and 98. So if I can remember those for just a second, 69, 15, 98. We can go over here to the outline color and do the same thing. Choose HSV, 69, 15, 98. Now we have that same color, and if we wanted to just make it a little bit darker, instead of having a really dark black boundary, we could make things look ever slightly more subtle by just using a darker value of that same color hue with even the same level of saturation. So now that's looking quite good. One thing that we still need to customize would be our rivers layer. So we can open up the properties for that. Again, we can simply double click on a layer to open the properties. And then there is actually a river option right here that uses an appropriate color. We can just go ahead and select that. And that is looking much better. We also have our capital cities layer. So let's just go here and look at some of the point symbol options. Again, symbology, single symbol, and then for the symbol itself, we can choose either from this list here, or we can customize the appearance. It's interesting to note that there are many different options automatically available, but sometimes that's not even what we're looking for. Sometimes we want to customize things on our own. So this symbol here I like in many ways for representing a capital city. It's very prominent. However, I do not like this green color. So we could just change that to white, and maybe we could make it a little bit smaller, but we still get that nice general appearance. Now let's think about adding a couple of other data layers to our map. We also have a populated places layer, so we can go ahead and add that. That contains more cities beyond just capital cities. We can move capitals on top to make sure that they remain highlighted. And then let's also add urban areas. The urban areas layer here is a polygon layer that shows the extent of urbanization. Now this is not looking bad, actually. The default color that could have been chosen for this could honestly have been quite a bit uglier, but one thing I'm noticing is that the boundaries of these urban areas are looking quite distracting. They are taking away a lot from the appearance of the map because of the intensity of that black boundary for these features. So we could just open up the style properties here. And one thing that I think works quite well is to use no outline color for some layers like this. And just hitting apply, you can see how nicely that makes those urban areas still stand out, but fade a little more into the background. So that's an awfully attractive look, I think, for that layer in particular. We could also, if we wanted to, customize the symbol, but this is actually pretty close to the symbol I was going to go for. I was thinking even of kind of an orangish color here. Maybe this with a little bit more lightness or a little less saturation, perhaps. Pretty close to what we have already, honestly. Just a little bit lighter. And I think that does the trick in terms of making this all look pretty visually appealing without being too overwhelming. Now these new populated places that we've added, I don't think that this red fill color fits very well. So we'll just go on in and consider perhaps making just a white circle, making it considerably smaller, maybe 5. That almost looks too small though, so maybe we could change that a little more. Maybe 8. Again, this is an iterative process, so this is something we simply change and experiment with as we go. Now that's almost looking a little bit big. So we could resize that maybe down to 6. Now these points are even appearing a little bit small. So let's just switch it up even more and make these points just darker gray. Not too large, not too intense, but just appropriately styled. Now I think this is really starting to come together. We have our country boundaries visible. We have an urban areas layer showing the extent of urbanization in this region. We have capital cities and we have populated areas as well. So looking quite good in general. Do note that we can customize the order of any of these, though I think the order right now is essentially where we would want it to be. We have the country boundaries, we have above that the urban areas, and generally then we would place the line layers above the polygon layers but below the point layers. And we have everything set up that way already. Now, in cartographic design, there is an important concept called visual hierarchy. We have already been kind of establishing visual hierarchy as we've been going with this mapping project. Visual hierarchy means that we want the eye to be drawn to the most important parts of the map before the eye is drawn anywhere else. This often means highlighting those features in some way that we want our viewers' attention to be drawn to. In this case, since we are thinking of making a reference map of the country of Spain, we would want the audience's attention to be immediately focused upon Spain. In order to do that, we'll make some changes that involve extracting the feature for Spain from the countries layer and then setting a different symbol property for that. So let's just save our document first. It's always a good practice to do that. And then let's select the country for Spain. Do note again that the selection tools are visible right here within the toolbar, and you can also get to selection tools from the selection menu. Interactive selection method lets you specify what happens when you use these selection tools. Let's just go ahead and use that selection tool though, and click on Spain. You'll see once we click on Spain, the various polygons that correspond to Spain's land area will all be highlighted. And then, with a nifty trick, we can simply right-click on that countries layer, and under the selection options, we can say, Create Layer from Selected Features. You can see that this then takes the countries layer and creates a copy of just that one feature up here on the very top of the table of contents. Now you would think at this point that we would be in good shape to start actually manipulating this data individually, but unfortunately due to a bug within ArcMap, instead of just working with this file right away, we want to export this isolated data layer now containing only Spain as its own shapefile. So that's a very easy process, and to export a data layer as a shapefile, we would simply right-click on it, choose Data, choose Export Data, and then we will navigate to where we want this file to be. So we'll navigate into our workspace, and then, as I mentioned, it is important at times to keep your shapefiles cleanly organized, since any shapefile consists of multiple different files that comprise it. So alongside all of our other data, we will create a folder. We'll just call it Spain. We'll open this up. And then for save as type, we will choose shapefile, and we will call it spain.shp. Make sure to preserve that extension. Hit save, OK, and then when you are prompted to add the data to the map, say yes. There we go. And now we have Spain isolated and actually represented from its own file. And now we can begin customizing this. So as you can see here, if we place Spain now just above all of the other country boundaries, it has a slightly different appearance. And we will still want to make some further customizations to this to ensure that Spain jumps out. This is called establishing figure ground. We want to highlight the area that is really the focus of the map and then use visual semantics to de-emphasize those regions that are not so important. So in this case, we would choose for a fill color. We can set it to the same fill color that we had before, so 69, 15, 98. Again, make sure to choose HSV before doing this, and then we can just turn down the saturation even a little more. Turn the value up to 99, so make it about as light as it can be without being white. And hit OK. Note then that the symbolization for Spain really now jumps out visually versus the surrounding countries. Yet I think we could do a little more to even de-emphasize the surrounding countries. So we could just take that value and we could take it down even more. And now Spain truly jumps out to the top when we are looking at this. At this point, we have now made some styling decisions that make this map look much more intelligible just based on cartographic design conventions. We have used visual language to essentially ensure that the contents of this map match what people expect to see when they see reference maps. And do note that while we are going to cover this much more in subsequent units and in subsequent classes, anytime you are looking for basic guidance as to how a given feature set should be symbolized in a reference map, there's no better thing to do than just look at other maps to see how other professional cartographers have represented certain features. It's almost always necessary to customize the default style properties that are provided when ArcGIS simply loads a layer. And when you are making those decisions about how to restyle data, it's very important that you make the appropriate decisions that reflect cartographic design best practices, especially just on the basis of what you see out in the world as a map user, in addition to a map designer. At this point, let's save our project and move on to reference mapping of a larger region. If we zoom out and take a look at Europe in general, we can see that this map is looking a little bit messier. If we turn off Spain itself, and then turn off the populated places layer, since that's kind of overwhelming, we are still seeing the same layers that we've seen before in terms of urban areas, rivers, and capital cities, as well as country borders, but things are looking just a little more overwhelming, and it's a little bit, in some cases, difficult to see national borders, and you really couldn't distinguish countries very cleanly from one another, even if we were to turn off the urban areas layer, for example. There is still enough busyness going on in the map that unless we know exactly where to look for different country boundaries, we might not be entirely certain what those boundaries are. In reference mapping, there are several different design conventions that are used to help users of a map to distinguish between different countries or different neighboring political features. One such technique involves using different fill colors for neighboring countries to ensure that it is easy to distinguish between the different polygons present on a map. We often do this for political entities like countries because there is no physical feature being represented necessarily that we could not represent or would be inappropriate to represent using certain fill colors. In doing that, we like to use relatively pastel colors that aren't too distracting, but instead just provide some visual context and highlight the distinction between the different polygons. In ArcGIS, there is an easy tool that we can use in the layer symbology to assign different colors to the different countries present within the map. However, we have to be careful that we are not assigning the same color to any neighboring features, because that would defeat the purpose. This is a problem that is pretty common in cartographic design, and because this is a dataset that is meant to be used for cartographic design, if we look here in the attribute table, we can see that there are several fields here that correspond to colors. So if we look at this field here called Map Color 7, this is a field that the Natural Earth dataset developers have added that corresponds to a topological color scheme for our map. We could use Map Color 7 in the values here, wherein each number would represent a different color of any hue. It doesn't make a difference as long as each hue is different. In that case, the developers of this map this dataset have set it up such that as long as we assign a different color hue to represent every one of these values, then no neighboring countries will share the same hue on a border. This again is very important for visualizing the country borders, that we don't have any countries bordering that share the same hue at the border. And normally, while that would be difficult to do because we have to take into account bordering or topology, this dataset makes this very easy. Yet at this point, we've only created a single symbol for any data layer. How is it that we assign different colors to different features? Well, fortunately, this is something that is very easy to do within ArcMap, and just involves setting a different symbology mode. We would open up the properties for our layer, and we would go right back to the Symbology tab. Except instead of using single symbol symbology, we would use categories. And under categories, we would choose unique values. We would then scroll down to the name of the field that contains the values. And in this case, we would use Map Color 7. Now, ArcMap will allow us to select a color ramp for this. In fact, the color ramp that I recommend using is the one that is already selected. Note that you could pick a variety of different color maps, but these relatively pastel ones containing colors of different hue but similar saturation and value is precisely what we're looking for, just as a way of representing the qualitative differences between these countries. So in this case, we would choose Add All Values. Then you would note that every one of these categories any one of the values from the attribute table will be assigned a color, and it will be assigned a color from the color ramp. If we wanted to choose a different color ramp, we could just as easily pick a different color ramp. But in this case, we do want some nice pastel colors here. We'd then hit Apply, and as you can see, every neighboring country has a different color assigned to it. So we've used that field to specify some style parameters here that make it much easier to distinguish in between the countries contained within this map. We could explore different color schemes. If we're not happy with this one, there are other options. Again, a relatively pastel color scheme is probably the way to go. This one is pastel but more muted, so still relatively low saturation. And some of these represent qualitative differences but are much more intense. Generally, though, we want to go with a map color scheme that is as clean and is as easy to interpret as possible. And generally, lighter colors represent that and help us to do that very well. So we can go back to this. The only issue now that I'm noting is that, of course, the background color corresponding to the oceans very closely matches the color used for some of our countries. So we would just want to modify this. Just as we've modified other colors before, we can go into more colors, and then we could use the HSV mode to ramp down the saturation while keeping value as high as possible. With that finished, we can take a look at our map, and that's really looking much better. We could look at the entirety of the region as well as other regions around the world. And you'll note that having those colors to differentiate the different countries from any neighboring countries really does help to improve the overall readability of the map. Note that especially if we turn off some of the other layers that are on top, we can much more clearly see some of these country boundaries, and the map is overall, at this point, quite easy to interpret.